Captain Marcus Thompson had been flying commercial jets for 18 years, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. As he completed his pre-flight checklist aboard Flight BA 447 from London Heathrow to New York JFK, he noticed an unusual commotion in the premium cabin through the cockpit door's small window. The Boeing 777 was nearly full that Tuesday evening in March, carrying 312 passengers including several high-profile individuals. Among them was Sergeant Major William Hayes, a decorated member of the Queen's Guard who had served the royal family for over 15 years. Hayes was traveling to New York for a special ceremony at the British consulate, where he would be honored for his distinguished service. Hayes had purchased his premium economy seat 6 months in advance, paying the full fare of $2,400 with his own savings. He was looking forward to the extra legroom and better service, especially since he was recovering from a recent knee surgery sustained during a ceremonial parade. The injury had required him to use a walking stick, and the additional space would help him stretch his leg during the long flight. As passengers boarded, Hayes settled into seat 12A, carefully stowing his ceremonial uniform in the overhead compartment. He was dressed in civilian clothes but carried his military identification and travel documents that clearly indicated his official status and purpose for the trip. The seat next to him remained empty, which he appreciated given his need to occasionally stretch his injured leg. Everything seemed normal until about 30 minutes before takeoff, when a well-dressed couple approached his row. The woman, later identified as Mrs. Victoria Ashworth, wife of a prominent London businessman, appeared agitated as she spoke loudly to a flight attendant named Sarah Chen. "Excuse me, but I believe there's been some mistake," Mrs. Ashworth declared, pointing toward Hayes. "My husband and I were supposed to have these seats together. We specifically requested 12A and 12B when we upgraded at the gate." Flight attendant Chen checked her tablet, frowning slightly. The upgrade system showed that the Ashworths had indeed been moved to premium economy after paying an additional $800 each at the gate. But Hayes's seat assignment was clearly valid and had been booked months earlier. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but this gentleman has a confirmed reservation for this seat," Chen explained politely. "However, I can see if we have other seats available together in premium economy." Mr. Richard Ashworth, a portly man in an expensive suit, joined the conversation with obvious irritation. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm Richard Ashworth of Ashworth Industries. We employ over 3,000 people and spend millions on corporate travel each year. Surely you can sort this out." Hayes remained calm throughout the exchange, understanding that travel mix-ups happened. He quietly offered to move if there was another suitable seat available, mentioning his knee injury and need for extra space. However, Chen's quick check revealed that the flight was completely full in premium economy, and the only available seats were in regular economy toward the back of the plane. The situation escalated when Mrs. Ashworth noticed Hayes's military identification card as he reached for his water bottle. "Oh, I see what this is about," she said with a dismissive tone. "Look, soldier boy, we paid good money for an upgrade. You can certainly sit in economy like everyone else." Other passengers began to notice the disturbance, with some pulling out their phones to record what was unfolding. Hayes felt his face flush with embarrassment but maintained his composure, a skill honed through years of military discipline. Senior flight attendant James Morrison, who had 22 years of experience with the airline, was called over to handle the situation. Morrison was known for his professionalism and ability to diffuse tense situations, but even he seemed perplexed by the complexity of this particular conflict. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to resolve this quickly as we're approaching our departure time," Morrison said diplomatically. "Mr. Hayes, I can see your reservation is completely valid and was made well in advance. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, while I appreciate your status as valued customers, we cannot simply move someone from a legitimately booked seat." The Ashworths were not satisfied with this response. Richard Ashworth pulled out his phone and began making calls, presumably to contacts within the airline or related travel industry. Meanwhile, his wife continued to argue that their last-minute upgrade should take precedence, especially given their frequent flyer status and business relationship with the airline. As the tension mounted, other premium economy passengers began to take sides. Some supported Hayes, recognizing his military service and noting that he had clearly been in his seat first with proper documentation. Others seemed swayed by the Ashworths' claims about their important business status and the money they had paid for the upgrade. Captain Thompson, monitoring the situation from the cockpit, began to worry about the departure delay. Air traffic control had already given them their slot, and any significant delay could result in a lengthy wait for a new departure time. The ripple effect could impact dozens of connecting flights and hundreds of passengers. The situation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Ashworth approached Hayes directly, seemingly attempting a different strategy. "Look, I'm sure you're a nice young man and we respect your service," she said in a tone that sounded more condescending than respectful. "But surely you can understand that some passengers have more urgent business matters than others. We're willing to compensate you for moving to economy class." Hayes politely declined the offer, explaining that his knee injury made the cramped economy seats problematic, and that he had specifically paid for his current seat to accommodate his medical needs. He showed them the doctor's note recommending additional legroom during travel. This revelation seemed to anger the Ashworths further, with Richard Ashworth claiming that Hayes was being unreasonable and holding up the entire flight for his own convenience. The irony of this statement was not lost on other passengers, who began murmuring their disapproval of the couple's behavior. Morrison realized that the situation was becoming untenable and made the decision to involve the ground supervisor. He called for backup while trying to keep both parties calm, knowing that any further escalation could result in security being called to remove disruptive passengers from the aircraft. Ground supervisor Amanda Foster arrived at the aircraft within 10 minutes, her experience immediately evident as she quickly assessed the volatile situation. Foster had handled countless passenger disputes over her 12-year career, but she could sense this one had the potential to become something much more serious. After reviewing the booking records on her tablet, Foster confirmed what flight attendant Chen had already established. Hayes's reservation was completely legitimate and had been made months in advance. The Ashworth's upgrade was valid as well, but they had been assigned to seats 15C and 15D, not the seats currently occupied by Hayes. "I understand everyone's frustration," Foster said calmly, addressing all parties. "Mr. Hayes, your seat assignment is absolutely correct, and I apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused you. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, your upgrade is confirmed, but for seats 15C and 15D, which are also premium economy with the same amenities." Richard Ashworth's face reddened as he rejected this solution. "This is completely unacceptable. We specifically requested seats together in the front section. That young man is clearly military, so he must be traveling on some sort of discounted ticket. Surely that gives paying customers like us priority." Foster explained that military personnel pay full fare unless they're on official orders with government-arranged travel, which was not the case here. Hayes had purchased his ticket with personal funds like any other passenger. However, her professional explanation seemed to fall on deaf ears as the Ashworths became increasingly belligerent. The situation attracted attention from passengers throughout the cabin, many of whom began expressing support for Hayes. An elderly gentleman in seat 10B stood up and offered to switch seats with Hayes, citing his own military service in the 1970s. Several other passengers voiced their disapproval of the Ashworths' behavior, with one woman commenting loudly that money doesn't buy you the right to bully people. Mrs. Ashworth, apparently frustrated by the lack of support from fellow passengers, made a comment that would later become central to the legal case. "This is ridiculous. We're being discriminated against because we're successful business people, while this soldier gets special treatment just because he wears a uniform." Hayes, maintaining his military bearing despite the obvious stress, quietly informed Foster that he would be willing to move to economy class if absolutely necessary, though he pointed out that his doctor had specifically recommended premium seating due to his recent knee surgery. He produced the medical documentation, which clearly stated that cramped seating could aggravate his injury and potentially delay his recovery. Foster found herself in an impossible situation. Company policy clearly supported Hayes's right to his legitimately booked seat, especially given his medical needs. However, the Ashworths were threatening to take their business elsewhere and had mentioned their connection to several corporate travel accounts worth millions of dollars annually to the airline. Captain Thompson, growing increasingly concerned about the departure delay, contacted Foster via the aircraft's internal phone system. Air traffic control was beginning to inquire about their status. and the captain knew that much more delay could result in losing their departure slot entirely. The tension reached a breaking point when Mrs. Ashworth began raising her voice, claiming that the airline was showing favoritism to military personnel over their real customers who actually pay full price. Her comments drew sharp responses from other passengers, including a businessman who pointed out that serving one's country deserved respect, not ridicule. In an attempt to de-escalate the situation, Morrison suggested offering the Ashworth seats in business class if any were available. Foster quickly checked the manifest and found 2 seats in business class that had been held for potential last-minute sales. However, these seats would represent a significant upgrade value of nearly $3,000 each, which would need approval from management. While Foster made calls to get authorization for the business class upgrade, the Ashworths continued their complaints, now directing their anger toward what they perceived as poor customer service from the airline. Richard Ashworth began threatening to contact the media about the situation, claiming that paying customers were being treated as second-class citizens. Their threats took on a more serious tone when Mrs. Ashworth declared that they would not only take their business elsewhere but would also ensure that their company's extensive corporate travel contracts with the airline would be reviewed. She mentioned specific amounts and routes, numbers that Foster recognized as representing substantial revenue for the airline. Hayes, observing the increasing hostility and recognizing the difficult position the airline staff were in, made an unexpected offer. He suggested that he could try to manage in an economy seat for the duration of the flight, despite his injury, if it would resolve the situation and allow the flight to depart on time. His selfless gesture drew nods of approval from nearby passengers and seemed to further highlight the contrast between his behavior and that of the Ashworths. However, Foster realized that allowing Hayes to be essentially bullied out of his legitimately booked seat could set a dangerous precedent and potentially expose the airline to discrimination claims. The fact that Hayes was a decorated member of the Queen's Guard made the situation even more sensitive from a public relations standpoint. The business class upgrade authorization came through just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point. Foster returned to inform the Ashworths that the airline was prepared to offer them complimentary business class seats as a gesture of goodwill, which would provide them with superior amenities and service compared to premium economy. Instead of being grateful for this generous offer, which represented thousands of pounds in value, the Ashworths seemed to view it as vindication of their complaints. Richard Ashworth smugly commented that this was more like it, and that the airline should have offered this solution from the beginning instead of wasting everyone's time defending a soldier who probably got his ticket for free. Anyway, this comment proved to be the final straw for many of the passengers who had been observing the situation. Several people began openly criticizing the Ashworths' attitude and behavior, with one passenger calling their comments disgraceful, and another stating that Hayes had shown more class and dignity than they had throughout the entire ordeal. Foster escorted the Ashworths to their new business class seats, hoping that the upgrade would finally end the confrontation. However, as they moved through the cabin, Mrs. Ashworth made one final comment that would later become crucial evidence in the lawsuit. "I suppose money does talk after all. Maybe next time that soldier will know his place." With the Ashworths finally settled in business class, Flight BA 447 was cleared for departure nearly 45 minutes behind schedule. Hayes remained in his original seat, though the stress of the confrontation was evident on his face despite his continued composure. Several passengers approached him during the boarding completion to express their support and apologize for the behavior he had endured. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Captain Thompson made the standard announcement about departure delays, diplomatically attributing the delay to passenger boarding issues without providing specific details. However, many passengers were already discussing the incident among themselves, and several had recorded portions of the confrontation on their mobile phones. During the flight attendant Morrison made a point of checking on Hayes regularly, ensuring he was comfortable and had everything he needed. Other crew members also went out of their way to provide excellent service, clearly sympathetic to what he had experienced. The gesture was appreciated by Hayes, who remained gracious and polite despite the earlier ordeal. Meanwhile, in business class, the Ashworths seemed to have settled into their upgraded seats but continued to make complaints about various aspects of the service. They criticized the meal options, complained about the temperature, and made several demands for additional amenities. The business class flight attendant, Patricia Williams, found their behavior increasingly difficult to manage. About 3 hours into the flight, Mrs. Ashworth approached Williams with yet another complaint. She claimed that her seat was not reclining properly and demanded to be moved to a different seat. When Williams explained that all business class seats were occupied and offered to have the maintenance crew check the seat mechanism upon landing, Mrs. Ashworth became agitated again. "This is exactly the kind of poor service I was talking about earlier," she declared loudly enough for other business class passengers to hear. "First, you accommodate that soldier overpaying customers, and now you can't even provide proper equipment. I want to speak to the captain immediately." Williams explained that the captain could not leave the cockpit during flight except in extreme emergencies, but offered to have him contacted via the aircraft's communication system if there was a genuine safety concern. Mrs. Ashworth insisted that her seat issue constituted a safety problem, though Williams's inspection revealed no mechanical defects. The situation in business class began attracting attention from other passengers, some of whom recognized the Ashworths from the earlier incident. Several passengers expressed their disapproval of the continued complaints, with one businessman commenting that he had traveled in far worse conditions without making such a fuss. Back in premium economy, Hayes was trying to rest when approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a passenger who had witnessed the earlier confrontation. Walsh, a physician traveling to a medical conference in New York, had noticed Hayes's walking stick and his careful movement suggesting pain from his knee injury. "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind my asking, but I noticed you might be experiencing some discomfort from an injury," Dr. Walsh said quietly. "I'm a physician, and I wanted to make sure that incident earlier didn't aggravate any medical condition you might have." Hayes appreciated her concern and explained his recent knee surgery and the doctor's recommendation for additional legroom during travel. Dr. Walsh examined his medical documentation and agreed that economy seating could indeed have worsened his condition, potentially requiring additional medical treatment upon arrival. "Would you be willing to provide a statement about the potential medical impact if you had been forced to sit in economy class?" Dr. Walsh asked. What happened earlier was not just poor customer service. It could have constituted a violation of disability accommodation requirements. This conversation was overheard by another passenger, Robert Chen, who happened to be a civil rights attorney specializing in discrimination cases. Chen had recorded portions of the earlier incident and had been disturbed by both the Ashworth's behavior and what he perceived as the airline's initial failure to firmly support a passenger with legitimate rights. Chen approached Hayes and Dr. Walsh, introducing himself and expressing his concern about what had transpired. "What you experienced earlier was not just poor customer service," he explained. "The comments made about your military status, combined with the attempt to force you from your seat despite your medical needs, could constitute multiple forms of discrimination." Hayes was reluctant to consider legal action, explaining that he preferred to avoid conflict and simply wanted to complete his journey to the ceremony in New York. However, Chen pointed out that the incident had broader implications beyond Hayes's personal experience. "This isn't just about you," Chen said. "If airlines allow passengers to be bullied out of legitimately booked seats based on perceived social status or military service, it sets a dangerous precedent. Other service members, disabled passengers, or anyone deemed less important by demanding customers could face similar treatment." Dr. Walsh agreed with Chen's assessment, noting that the medical aspect made the situation particularly serious. If you had been forced into inadequate seating and your injury had been aggravated, you could have required emergency medical care upon landing. The airline's initial hesitation to firmly support your legitimate accommodation needs was concerning. Word of the legal discussion spread through the premium economy section, and several other passengers approached to offer their support and testimony. Many had been appalled by the Ashworth's behavior and the initial response from airline staff, though they praised the crew's eventual handling of the situation. Meanwhile, the Ashworths continued to create disturbances in business class. Richard Ashworth demanded to use the aircraft's phone system to contact his business associates, claiming that the flight delay had caused him to miss important calls. When informed of the charges for in-flight phone service, he demanded that the airline cover the costs as compensation for the earlier inconvenience. The situation escalated further when Mrs. Ashworth accused the business class flight attendant of providing inferior service compared to other passengers. She claimed that other passengers were receiving larger meal portions and more frequent drink service. Allegations that Williams found both untrue and increasingly difficult to address professionally. Captain Thompson received multiple reports about continued disturbances from both sections of the aircraft. Though the reports about Hayes were all positive, praising his patience and dignity throughout the ordeal. The reports about the Ashworths, however, detailed ongoing complaints and increasingly unreasonable demands. As the flight progressed toward New York, several passengers had contacted friends and family members about the incident using the aircraft's Wi-Fi service. Social media posts began appearing describing the situation, though most were careful not to name specific individuals or provide identifying details. By the time the aircraft began its descent into JFK Airport, the incident had taken on a life of its own. Multiple passengers had decided to provide statements supporting Hayes if any formal complaints were filed. Dr. Walsh had documented the potential medical implications of forcing Hayes from his appropriate seating, and Attorney Chen had begun researching relevant discrimination laws and airline passenger rights regulations. Flight BA 447 touched down at JFK Airport nearly 50 minutes behind schedule, but the real turbulence was just beginning. As passengers prepared to disembark, the Ashworths made one final complaint to the flight crew, demanding written documentation of their upgrade compensation and threatening to file formal complaints about the service they had received. Ground Supervisor Foster, who had remained in contact with the crew throughout the flight, was waiting at the gate with additional airline management personnel. The reports from the flight crew about continued disturbances had prompted the airline to prepare for potential formal complaints from multiple parties. Hayes gathered his belongings quietly, still maintaining his dignified composure despite the obvious physical discomfort from his knee injury. Several passengers stopped to shake his hand and thank him for his service, while others expressed their outrage about how he had been treated. Dr. Walsh approached Hayes one final time before disembarking. "I've written a detailed medical assessment of the situation," she said, handing him a formal document. "This clearly states that forcing you into inadequate seating could have caused serious medical complications. If you decide to pursue any formal action, this documentation could be crucial." Attorney Chen also provided Hayes with his business card and a preliminary legal assessment he had drafted during the flight. "I've documented several potential legal violations based on what I witnessed," he explained. "Federal law requires airlines to provide reasonable accommodations for passengers with disabilities, and the discrimination based on your military status could violate civil rights statutes." As passengers filed off the aircraft, several stopped to provide their contact information to Hayes, offering to serve as witnesses if needed. The support from fellow travelers was overwhelming, with many expressing their disgust at the Ashworths' behavior and the airline's initial response to the situation. The Ashworths, meanwhile, were among the first to disembark and immediately demanded to speak with airport management. They had prepared a lengthy list of complaints about their treatment, claiming that they had been discriminated against as business travelers and that the airline had failed to provide the level of service appropriate for their status. Richard Ashworth was particularly vocal in his complaints, telling anyone who would listen that the airline had prioritized freeloading military personnel over legitimate paying customers. His comments were overheard by several airport personnel, including a retired Air Force colonel working as a customer service representative who was visibly disturbed by the remarks. Within hours of landing, social media posts about the incident began gaining traction. While most posts were careful not to name specific individuals, they described the general situation and praised Hayes for his dignity, while criticizing the unnamed passengers who had created the disturbance. The airline's corporate communications team, monitoring social media mentions, quickly identified that something significant had occurred on flight BA 447. Initial reports suggested a passenger dispute, but the volume and tone of the posts indicated this was more serious than a typical travel complaint. Hayes, unaware of the growing social media attention, proceeded to his hotel near the British consulate, His knee was bothering him more than usual after the stress and prolonged sitting, despite having the premium economy seat. He couldn't help but think about how much worse his condition might have been if he had been forced into a cramped economy seat. The next morning, Hayes received an unexpected call from Colonel Patricia Reynolds, the military attaché at the British consulate. Reynolds had received reports about the incident and was calling to ensure Hayes was well and to offer any assistance the consulate could provide. "Sergeant Major Hayes," Reynolds said formally, "we've received some concerning reports about your travel experience yesterday. I want you to know that any mistreatment of British military personnel reflects not just on the airline involved, but potentially on diplomatic relations. Are you comfortable discussing what occurred?" Hayes provided a factual account of the events, emphasizing that he had tried to handle the situation with minimal conflict, and that some airline staff had ultimately been helpful. However, Reynolds was clearly disturbed by the description of events, particularly the discriminatory comments about military service. "This is not just a customer service issue," Reynolds explained. "When British military personnel are subjected to discrimination or harassment while traveling on official business, it becomes a matter of concern for His Majesty's government. I will be reporting this incident through appropriate diplomatic channels." Meanwhile, the airline's internal investigation team had begun reviewing the incident. Customer Service Manager David Parks pulled the flight records, crew reports, and any available audio or video documentation from the aircraft. The crew's reports painted a clear picture of the events, with particular attention to the discriminatory comments made by the Ashworths. Parks was experienced in handling passenger complaints, but this case presented unusual complexities. The airline had multiple potential liability issues: possible discrimination against military personnel, failure to accommodate a passenger with medical needs, and potential violations of passenger rights regulations. The legal implications became clearer when Parks received a formal letter from Attorney Chen, who had acted quickly to document the incident. The letter detailed multiple potential legal violations and demanded a formal response from the airline within 10 business days. Chen's letter outlined several key points: the airline's initial failure to firmly support Hayes's legitimate seat assignment, the discriminatory comments made by other passengers that went unchallenged by crew, the potential violation of disability accommodation requirements, and the precedent set by appearing to reward disruptive behavior with upgrades. The airline's legal department, headed by Senior Counsel Margaret Thompson, recognized immediately that this case could have far-reaching implications. Recent court decisions had established that airlines could be held liable for failing to protect passengers from discrimination by other passengers, especially when crew members witnessed such behavior. Thompson convened an emergency meeting with senior management, including customer service, operations, and public relations departments. The social media attention was growing, and several news outlets had begun making inquiries about reported discrimination against military personnel on the airline's flights. "We need to understand that this is not just about one incident," Thompson explained to the management team. "How we handle this case will set precedents for future situations involving passenger conflicts, discrimination claims, and our obligations to protect vulnerable passengers from harassment by others." The airline's chief executive officer, Sarah Mitchell, made the decision to conduct a comprehensive investigation and to reach out directly to Hayes to offer a formal apology and appropriate compensation. However, Mitchell also recognized that the airline might be facing significant legal action regardless of their response. By the end of the week, Hayes had received formal communications from multiple parties. The airline had sent a lengthy apology letter and offer of compensation. The British consulate had opened a formal inquiry, and Attorney Chen had begun preparing a federal discrimination lawsuit on Hayes's behalf. The Ashworths, unaware of the growing legal and diplomatic complications, had filed their own complaint with the airline demanding compensation for what they claimed was poor service and discrimination against business travelers. Their complaint included demands for refunds, future travel vouchers, and an apology for prioritizing military passengers over paying customers. 3 weeks after the incident, the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Attorney Chen had filed a federal discrimination lawsuit against the airline on behalf of Hayes, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights statutes, and airline passenger protection regulations. The case quickly attracted media attention due to its implications for military personnel and disabled passengers. The lawsuit detailed several key allegations. The airline's failure to protect Hayes from harassment and discrimination by other passengers, the initial reluctance to enforce his legitimate seat assignment, the discriminatory comments that went unchallenged by crew members, and the potential precedent set by rewarding disruptive behavior with valuable upgrades. Colonel Reynolds at the British consulate had escalated the matter through diplomatic channels, resulting in formal inquiries from the British Embassy to U.S. transportation authorities. The incident had become a diplomatic issue, with British officials expressing concern about the treatment of their military personnel by American commercial carriers. The airline's response strategy, developed by CEO Sarah Mitchell and her senior team, involved multiple approaches. They issued a public apology to Hayes and all military personnel, implemented new crew training protocols for handling discrimination incidents, and established a special review process for complaints involving military or disabled passengers. However, the airline also faced an unexpected complication when the Ashworths retained their own legal representation. Their attorney, Marcus Whitfield, filed a counter-lawsuit claiming that the airline had discriminated against his clients based on their wealth and business status, prioritizing military passengers over legitimate paying customers. Whitfield's legal strategy was controversial, but not without precedent. He argued that the airline's ultimate decision to upgrade the Ashworths to business class proved that they had been wrongly denied appropriate accommodation initially. He claimed that the negative publicity in social media attention had damaged his clients' reputations and business relationships. The media coverage of the dual lawsuits created a public relations nightmare for the airline. News outlets struggled with how to present the competing claims, with some focusing on the discrimination against Hayes while others examined the broader questions about customer service policies and passenger rights. Social media reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of Hayes, with thousands of posts praising his dignity and service while criticizing the Ashworths' behavior. However, some business publications questioned whether airlines were creating unrealistic expectations by accommodating every passenger demand, regardless of legitimacy. The airline's internal investigation, led by customer service manager Parks, had uncovered additional concerning details. Review of the crew training record showed that staff had not received adequate preparation for handling discrimination incidents between passengers. The investigation also revealed that the airline's policy of offering upgrades to resolve disputes might inadvertently reward disruptive behavior. Flight attendant Morrison, who had been central to the incident, was interviewed extensively by both the airline's investigators and attorneys representing both sides. Morrison's detailed account confirmed that the Ashworths had made discriminatory comments about Hayes's military status and that the crew had struggled to respond appropriately to the situation. In my 22 years with this airline, I've never encountered a situation quite like this, Morrison told investigators. We're trained to provide excellent customer service, but we're not prepared to handle cases where passengers are actively discriminating against other passengers. The crew felt caught between competing demands and unclear policies. Dr. Walsh, the physician who had examined Hayes during the flight, provided expert testimony about the medical implications of the incident. Her report detailed how forcing Hayes from his appropriate seating could have worsened his knee injury, potentially requiring emergency medical treatment and prolonging his recovery time. The medical documentation was clear that this passenger required additional legroom due to his surgical recovery, Dr. Walsh stated in her deposition. The airline's initial hesitation to firmly support his accommodation needs could have resulted in serious medical complications. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about preventing further injury. The case attracted attention from military advocacy groups, disability rights organizations, and airline passenger protection advocates. Each group filed amicus briefs supporting different aspects of Hayes's lawsuit, arguing that the incident represented broader systemic issues in airline passenger treatment. Military advocacy groups emphasized the particular vulnerability of service members traveling in civilian clothes, who might not receive recognition for their service and sacrifice. They argued that Hayes's dignified behavior under pressure exemplified military values and made the discrimination even more egregious. Disability rights organizations, focused on the medical accommodation issues, arguing that the airline's policies failed to adequately protect passengers with legitimate medical needs from harassment by other passengers. They pointed to Hayes's case as an example of how discrimination could compound medical accommodation failures. The Ashworths, meanwhile, found themselves facing unexpected public scrutiny. Although their names had not been officially released, social media investigations had identified them, leading to negative publicity for Richard Ashworth's business. Several corporate clients reportedly began reviewing their relationships with Ashworth Industries following the incident. Mrs. Ashworth's comments during the flight had been recorded by multiple passengers, and excerpts had been shared widely on social media, despite legal efforts to suppress them. The recordings captured her dismissive attitude toward Hayes's military service and her sense of entitlement, based on wealth and social status. The airline's legal team, led by Margaret Thompson, recognized that they were facing a complex multi-front legal battle. The discrimination claims against Hayes were serious and well documented, while the Ashworths' counter-lawsuit, though controversial, raised questions about consistent application of customer service policies. Thompson's analysis revealed several concerning liability issues. Federal regulations required airlines to accommodate passengers with disabilities, and Hayes's medical needs clearly qualified. The crew's initial hesitation to firmly support his legitimate rights could be seen as a violation of these requirements. Additionally, recent court precedents had established that airlines could be held liable for failing to protect passengers from discrimination by other passengers, especially when crew members witnessed discriminatory behavior. The recorded comments about Hayes's military status clearly fell into this category. The case took an unexpected turn when Captain Thompson, the pilot of Flight BA447, came forward with additional information. Thompson revealed that he had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit and had considered having the disruptive passengers removed from the aircraft, but had been advised by ground control that removal would create additional delays and complications. From a safety and operational standpoint, the situation was becoming untenable, Captain Thompson testified. I had passengers arguing, crew members struggling to maintain control, and mounting pressure from air traffic control about our departure delay. The decision to upgrade the disruptive passengers to business class may have resolved the immediate situation, but it sent the wrong message about acceptable behavior. The airline's insurance company, reviewing the potential liability exposure, estimated that the Hayes lawsuit could result in significant damages if successful. The precedent-setting nature of the case meant that any judgment could affect how airlines handle similar situations in the future, potentially creating industry-wide policy changes. 8 months after the incident, the legal battle reached its climax in federal court. Judge Rebecca Martinez presided over what had become a landmark case in airline passenger rights and discrimination law. The courtroom was packed with media, representatives, military advocates, disability rights activists, and airline industry observers who recognized the far-reaching implications of the pending decision. Attorney Chen presented a compelling case on behalf of Hayes, methodically documenting each aspect of the discrimination and policy failures. He played audio recordings from passengers that captured the Ashworths' discriminatory comments, presented Dr. Walsh's medical testimony about the potential consequences of forcing Hayes from his appropriate seat, and demonstrated how the airline's response had effectively rewarded disruptive behavior. This case is about more than one incident on one flight, Chen argued in his opening statement. It's about whether airlines have a responsibility to protect vulnerable passengers from discrimination and harassment by other passengers. Sergeant Major Hayes served his country with distinction for 15 years, only to be subjected to harassment and discrimination because of that very service. The airline's defense team, led by senior attorney Patricia Moore, acknowledged the unfortunate nature of the incident, while arguing that the crew had ultimately resolved the situation appropriately. They emphasized that Hayes had retained his original seat, that the discriminatory passengers had been moved away from him, and that the airline had since implemented comprehensive policy changes to prevent similar incidents. Moore's strategy focused on demonstrating that the airline had acted reasonably under difficult circumstances and had ultimately protected Hayes's rights. However, Her defense was complicated by the recorded evidence of discriminatory comments and the crew's initial hesitation to firmly support Hayes's legitimate seat assignment. The Ashworths' counter-lawsuit, presented by attorney Whitfield, proved to be a significant liability for their case. Whitfield argued that his clients had been discriminated against based on their wealth and business status, but the recorded evidence of their behavior severely undermined their credibility. The jury visibly reacted negatively to audio recordings of Mrs. Ashworth's dismissive comments about military service and her sense of entitlement. Hayes testified with the same dignity and composure he had shown during the original incident. His account was factual and measured, focusing on the events rather than his emotional response to the discrimination. When asked about the impact of the incident, he spoke quietly about how it had affected his view of civilian attitudes toward military service and his confidence in traveling commercially. "I've served my country for 15 years, including deployments in dangerous locations," Hayes testified. "I never expected that one of the most difficult situations I would face would be on a commercial flight, simply trying to get to a ceremony honoring my service. The discrimination I experienced was more hurtful than any physical injury I've sustained." Dr. Walsh's medical testimony proved particularly damaging to the airline's defense. She explained in detail how Hayes's knee injury required specific accommodation and how forcing him into inadequate seating could have caused permanent damage. Her professional assessment that the airline's initial response had endangered Hayes's health added a serious dimension to the discrimination claims. The trial took an unexpected turn when several passengers from Flight BA447 testified about the broader impact of the incident. They described how the Ashworths' behavior had created a hostile environment for all passengers, and how the crew's initial uncertainty had made the situation worse for everyone involved. Robert Martinez, a businessman who had witnessed the entire incident, provided particularly compelling testimony. "I travel frequently for work, and I've never seen anything like the behavior displayed by those passengers. Their sense of entitlement was shocking. But what was more concerning was watching the airline staff struggle to respond appropriately to clear discrimination against a military service member. The airline's internal documents, revealed during discovery, showed that the company had received previous complaints about discrimination incidents but had failed to develop adequate training or policies for crew members. Email exchanges between management revealed concerns about the incident's potential legal implications and the precedent set by upgrading disruptive passengers. Flight attendant Morrison's testimony was particularly impactful. He described the impossible position the crew had been placed in, trying to balance customer service expectations with passenger rights and safety concerns. His 22 years of experience lent credibility to his assessment that the airline's policies were inadequate for handling discrimination incidents. "We're trained to provide excellent service to all passengers, but we weren't prepared for a situation where passengers were actively discriminating against other passengers," Morrison testified. "The company's emphasis on customer satisfaction sometimes conflicts with protecting passengers' rights, and this case exposed those contradictions." The Ashworths' testimony proved disastrous for their counter-lawsuit. Under cross-examination, both Richard and Victoria Ashworth appeared arrogant and unrepentant about their behavior. Mrs. Ashworth's attempt to justify her comments about Hayes's military service drew audible gasps from the courtroom gallery. When asked directly about her comment that Hayes should know his place, Mrs. Ashworth replied, "I was simply pointing out that some passengers have more urgent business needs than others. We pay full fare and contribute significantly to the airline's revenue through our corporate accounts." This response prompted sharp questioning from Judge Martinez, who asked Mrs. Ashworth to clarify whether she believed military service members deserved less consideration than business travelers. Mrs. Ashworth's evasive and condescending response further damaged their credibility with the jury. The case concluded with powerful closing arguments from both sides. Chen emphasized the broader implications of the case for military personnel and disabled passengers, arguing that airlines must be held accountable for protecting vulnerable passengers from discrimination and harassment. If airlines can allow passengers to be bullied out of their legitimate accommodations based on perceived social status or military service, then no passenger is truly protected, Chen argued. Sergeant Major Hayes's dignity and restraint should not be rewarded with discrimination and harassment. This case will determine whether airlines have a responsibility to protect all passengers equally, regardless of their ability to complain loudly or spend extravagantly. The airline's closing argument acknowledged the problems with the incident, while emphasizing the policy changes implemented since then. Moore argued that the airline had learned from the situation and had taken concrete steps to prevent similar incidents, including comprehensive crew training and clear protocols for handling discrimination complaints. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that shocked the airline industry. They found in favor of Hayes on all major claims, awarding him $2.4 million in damages for discrimination, emotional distress, and violation of his rights under disability accommodation laws. The jury specifically noted that the airline's initial EFOOL response had been inadequate, and that the precedent set by upgrading disruptive passengers had encouraged discriminatory behavior. The Ashworths' counter-lawsuit was dismissed entirely, with the jury finding that their behavior had been discriminatory and disruptive, not deserving of accommodation or compensation. The judge noted in her final ruling that the recorded evidence of their discriminatory comments had made their claims of reverse discrimination completely without merit. The verdict sent shockwaves through the airline industry, establishing new precedents for passenger protection and airline liability. Within weeks, major carriers began implementing comprehensive policy changes to address discrimination incidents and protect vulnerable passengers from harassment by other travelers. Hayes donated a significant portion of his settlement to military and disability advocacy organizations, continuing to demonstrate the same selfless character that had been evident throughout the ordeal. The ceremony at the British consulate, which had originally brought him to New York, was eventually held with much greater fanfare, as Hayes had become a symbol of dignity under pressure and the importance of protecting service members' rights. The case became a landmark precedent in aviation law, regularly cited in subsequent discrimination and passenger rights cases. The airline implemented sweeping policy changes, including mandatory discrimination response training for all crew members and clear protocols for protecting passengers from harassment by other travelers. The Ashworths faced their own consequences beyond the legal defeat. Richard Ashworth's business suffered significant damage from the negative publicity, with several major clients terminating their relationships with Ashworth Industries. The couple largely withdrew from public life, though they never publicly apologized for their behavior during the incident. The case ultimately transformed how airlines handle passenger conflicts involving discrimination, establishing clear legal obligations to protect vulnerable passengers and creating accountability for crew responses to discriminatory behavior. Hayes's